She didn't come to therapy because her relationships failed. Most people do. They come after heartbreak, after betrayal, after something clearly goes wrong. But that wasn't the case here. She came because something stranger kept happening. Every relationship she had followed the same path. At first, everything felt natural, effortless. Two people meeting, talking for hours, laughing about small things, sharing personal stories sooner than expected. There was an attraction, there was curiosity, and there was that quiet feeling people often describe when they say, this might actually become something real. And for a while, it always did. The connection deepened. Time together became easier. The other person began to matter. But then something changed. Not gradually, suddenly. Right when the relationship started feeling serious, something inside her shifted. Doubts appeared out of nowhere. Small things started bothering her. She would notice flaws she had never cared about before. She would feel restless during moments that once felt comforting. And slowly, almost without planning it, she would begin pulling away. Less texting, less enthusiasm, more distance, until eventually the relationship ended. Not because there was no love, not because the other person did something wrong, but because something inside her reacted the moment love began to feel real. And the strangest part, this didn't happen once. It happened every single time. Different partners, different personalities, different stories, but the ending was always the same. This raised a difficult question. If the same ending keeps repeating, is the problem really the relationship? Or is something deeper quietly shaping the outcome? Part 1. The pattern she couldn't explain. 1:15 to 4:30. Laura was 33. She was thoughtful, emotionally intelligent, and very aware of her inner world. She could describe her feelings clearly. She reflected on her behavior, that she genuinely wanted to understand herself. And that made the pattern even more confusing, because she wasn't someone who avoided relationships. In fact, she enjoyed meeting people. She liked meaningful conversations. She liked emotional connection. Starting a relationship never scared her. If anything, the beginning felt exciting. New energy, new stories, new possibilities. She could be open, playful, interested. But what she struggled with wasn't beginning a relationship. It was staying once things became deeper. Each relationship followed a very similar trajectory. First came excitement, the early stage where everything feels fresh and full of possibility. Then came comfort, the stage where conversations become easier and silence stops feeling awkward. After that came closeness, the moment when both people start sharing more personal thoughts, plans, and emotional vulnerability. And that's exactly when something inside her reacted, and she described it with surprising precision. "It feels like a switch flips inside me," she once said. "One moment I feel safe and happy, and the next moment I feel trapped." The feeling didn't arrive slowly. It appeared almost instantly, and once it appeared, it was difficult to ignore. Suddenly, she would start questioning the relationship. She would analyze small behaviors. She would notice things that seemed wrong. Things that previously felt harmless now felt irritating. Oh, and even though part of her still cared deeply for the other person, another part felt an overwhelming urge to escape. Not because the partner was dangerous, not because the relationship was unhealthy, but because closeness itself began to feel uncomfortable. At first, she thought maybe she was just choosing the wrong people, but over time, that explanation stopped making sense. because the people were different. Some were calm, some were passionate, some were quiet, some were ambitious. And yet the emotional turning point was identical every time, which meant the pattern probably wasn't about them. It was about what happened inside her the moment the relationship started feeling stable. Part 2. When the problem isn't the other person, 4:30 to 8. To understand the pattern better, we examined her previous relationships carefully. Not just the endings, but the entire timeline, how they began, how they developed, and exactly when things started changing. At first glance, the relationships looked completely different. Different lifestyles, different values, different life circumstances. Some partners were highly expressive, others were more reserved. Some relationships lasted only months, others lasted longer. But when we mapped the emotional turning point, something remarkable appeared. The moment of withdrawal always happened under the same conditions. It didn't happen during the conflict. It didn't happen when the partner became distant. And it didn't happen after disappointment. Instead, it happened during something most people would consider positive: consistency. When the other person became reliably present, when texts arrived without hesitation, when plans for the future started appearing naturally in conversation, when affection stopped feeling uncertain. In the early stages of dating, there is often a degree of unpredictability. You wonder how the other person feels. You analyze messages. You question where things are going. But eventually, if the relationship continues, that uncertainty begins to fade. The other person becomes predictable in a comforting way. They call when they say they will. They show up when they promise. Their care becomes obvious. For many people, this is the moment relationships start feeling safe. But for Laura, this was the exact moment anxiety appeared, when the relationship stopped feeling uncertain, when she no longer had to guess whether the other person cared, when the connection became emotionally stable. That's when the discomfort began. Not before loss, before stability, not before rejection, before commitment, which led to an important realization. What if the fear wasn't about losing love? What if the fear was about receiving it fully? Part 3. Why stability can feel more threatening than distance, 8 o'clock to 11:30. At first, this reaction seems confusing. Why would someone feel uncomfortable when a relationship finally becomes safe? Most people imagine fear appearing when love is uncertain, when someone might leave, or when rejection feels possible. That would make sense. But in Laura's case, the anxiety didn't appear during uncertainty. It appeared during stability. The moment the relationship started feeling secure, her body reacted. To understand why this happens, it helps to look at how the nervous system actually works. And the brain does not only respond to what a person wants, it responds to what feels familiar. And familiarity is often shaped long before adult relationships ever begin. For someone whose early experiences included unpredictable connections, emotional safety can feel strangely unfamiliar. Even when the present situation is calm and healthy, the nervous system may still be scanning for signs that something will eventually go wrong. It is not a logical process. It is protective. Laura wasn't consciously thinking that love was dangerous. She wanted love. She wanted a connection. But somewhere deeper, her body had learned that closeness carried a certain kind of risk. Not the risk of immediate conflict, but the risk of emotional exposure. When a relationship stays casual, there is still distance. You can enjoy the connection without depending on it too much. If something ends, the loss is easier to manage. But when a relationship becomes stable, something else appears, a dependence. You begin to care more deeply about the other person's presence. Their absence would hurt more. Their opinion matters more. Their role in your life becomes larger. And with that closeness comes vulnerability. For Laura, vulnerability did not feel neutral. It felt dangerous. Not because her partners were harmful, but because her nervous system had learned that emotional closeness could eventually lead to pain she could not control. So when the relationship reached that stage, and her mind tried to protect her, not through conscious decisions, but through subtle emotional shifts, doubts appeared. Small irritations became magnified. Normal imperfections started feeling like serious problems. These reactions were not random. They were a protective strategy. If she could convince herself that the relationship was flawed, then leaving it would feel logical rather than frightening. Distance would feel like a choice instead of a loss. In this way, the mind quietly reduces vulnerability by creating emotional space. From the outside, it may look like self-sabotage, but from the inside, it feels like survival. The nervous system is trying to prevent a familiar kind of pain by ending the connection before that pain has the chance to arrive, which means something important was happening. Laura was not rejecting love itself. She was reacting to what love represented: dependence, exposure, and the terrifying possibility of caring about someone deeply enough that losing them would truly hurt. So before that vulnerability could fully exist, her system created distance, not deliberately, not rationally, but protectively. And once this mechanism begins, it can repeat again and again, quietly shaping every relationship that follows. Because if closeness feels like danger, the mind will always try to escape before it becomes too important to lose. But where did that expectation come from in the first place? Part 4. A childhood of unpredictable connection, 11:30 to 15:30. When Laura talked about her childhood, nothing sounded obviously traumatic. There were no dramatic stories of abuse or abandonment. No single event that clearly explained why closeness later felt so complicated. In many ways, her childhood looked normal from the outside. Her caregivers loved her. They provided for her. They cared about her well-being. But when she described the emotional atmosphere of her home, a different picture slowly appeared. The word she used most often was inconsistent. Some days her caregivers were warm, attentive, and emotionally present. They listened to her, laughed with her, and made her feel safe. Other days felt very different. They were distracted, preoccupied, emotionally distant, not intentionally unkind, but unavailable in subtle ways that were difficult for a child to understand. Sometimes a question would receive a thoughtful response. Other times, the same question would be met with impatience or silence. Sometimes affection felt easy and natural. Other times, it felt like something she had to approach carefully. As a child, she never knew exactly which version she would encounter. And for a developing nervous system, unpredictability can shape how connections are experienced. Children learn about relationships through repetition. If care is consistent, the brain begins to associate closeness with safety. But if care appears and disappears unpredictably, the brain learns something slightly different. It learns that a connection can exist, but it might not last. So the child adapts, not consciously, but instinctively. Laura became very good at forming connections quickly. She could read emotional cues well. She sensed shifts in mood before they were obvious. This helped her maintain closeness when it was available. But at the same time, and she learned something else. She learned not to rely too heavily on that closeness. Because if emotional warmth could disappear without warning, depending on it too much would eventually hurt. So she developed a quiet strategy. Stay connected, but stay careful. Enjoy closeness, but never fully trust that it will remain. This strategy worked surprisingly well during childhood. It allowed her to navigate emotional unpredictability without feeling completely overwhelmed. But strategies that protect children sometimes follow them into adulthood, even when the environment has changed. As an adult, her partners were not emotionally inconsistent in the same way. Many of them were stable, attentive, and genuinely committed. But her nervous system was still shaped by the earlier pattern it had learned. Connection could exist, but trusting its permanence felt risky. So when relationships began feeling secure, a familiar internal signal appeared. The same quiet warning her mind had learned years earlier. Do not rely too much. Do not become too dependent, because something that feels safe today might disappear tomorrow. And when that belief operates quietly in the background, closeness can start feeling less like comfort and more like something that needs to be managed carefully. Not avoided completely, but never trusted fully. Which meant something important was happening in Laura's adult relationships. However, her reactions were not really about the present. They were about an emotional expectation formed much earlier. And once that expectation exists, the brain begins interpreting new experiences through the lens of the past, even when the present is very different. But that raised another question. If her partners were stable, why did her body still react as if something dangerous might happen? Part 5. Why her brain associated love with risk, 1530 to 1830. By this point, the pattern was becoming easier to understand. Laura didn't struggle with connection, she didn't struggle with attraction, and she didn't struggle with caring deeply about someone. The difficulty appeared later, when the relationship began to feel stable enough that it truly mattered. Because stability changes the emotional stakes. In the early stage of a relationship, there is still uncertainty. Two people are exploring each other's personalities, habits, and values. There is curiosity and excitement, and sometimes even a little emotional distance. But when a relationship grows stronger, something shifts quietly beneath the surface. The connection begins to feel real, not temporary, not experimental, real. Plans start appearing in small ways. A conversation about a trip months from now, meeting each other's friends, talking about long-term goals. These moments signal something important. The relationship is becoming part of your life. And once something becomes part of your life, losing it becomes painful. For Laura, this was the exact moment her nervous system reacted. Not because the relationship was unhealthy, but because it had become emotionally significant. Her mind wasn't simply observing the present. It was comparing the present with emotional memories stored long ago. The brain is designed to recognize patterns. When something in the present resembles something from the past, the nervous system reacts quickly, sometimes faster than conscious thought. For Laura, a deep emotional closeness resembled an old emotional situation, a situation where care once existed but sometimes disappeared, where connection sometimes turned into distance without warning. So when her adult relationships became stable and meaningful, her brain quietly prepared for the possibility of that old disappointment returning, even if there was no real sign of it. This is how emotional learning often works. The brain does not always wait for proof of danger. If something reminds it of an earlier painful experience, it may react as if the danger is already approaching. And once that reaction begins, the mind tries to protect itself. One way it does this is by creating emotional distance. Another way is by changing how the relationship is perceived. Suddenly, the partner's small habits begin to look irritating. Differences feel larger. Questions about compatibility become louder. The mind begins building a logical case for leaving. But the deeper motivation is often protection. If the relationship ends early, the potential pain of losing it later never has the chance to occur. In other words, the mind tries to control the timing of the hurt. This is one of the hidden mechanisms behind self-sabotage. It is not about destroying something good. It is about avoiding the helpless feeling of unexpected loss. Choosing the ending yourself can feel less frightening than waiting for someone else to cause it. From the outside, this behavior may look confusing. Partners often feel blindsided. They remember the connection being warm and affectionate only weeks earlier. They may wonder what suddenly changed. But inside Laura's experience, the shift made emotional sense. Her nervous system believed it was preventing future pain. If closeness equals vulnerability and vulnerability equals possible loss, then reducing closeness feels like safety. Unfortunately, this strategy has a difficult side effect. By leaving relationships early, the nervous system never experiences a different outcome. It never learns that stability can actually continue, that a partner can remain present, that affection does not always disappear. So the old belief remains unchallenged. Love eventually leads to disappointment. Attachment eventually leads to loss. And distance feels like the safest position to maintain. The tragedy of this pattern is that it quietly blocks the very experience capable of changing it. A stable relationship. One that lasts long enough for the nervous system to realize something new. That closeness does not always lead to abandonment. That care can remain steady. That vulnerability does not automatically end in pain. But for that learning to happen, the protective reaction has to be recognized first, because you cannot change a pattern you cannot see. And for the first time, Laura was beginning to see the mechanism clearly. This led to a crucial moment in the process, and the moment she realized exactly when her urge to withdraw appeared, and why it always arrived during the most tender moments of connection. Part 6. The moment she saw the mechanism, 1830 to 2030. Understanding the theory behind a pattern is one thing. Seeing it happen in real time is something very different. For a long time, Laura had only looked at her relationships from the outside. She remembered the beginning, the excitement, the connection, and then the eventual distance. But the exact moment where the shift began always felt blurry. It seemed sudden, unexplainable, almost random. So one day we slowed the process down. Instead of focusing on why relationships ended, we focused on something much smaller. The precise moment the urge to withdraw appeared. Not the arguments, not the breakups. Just the moment when something inside her started pulling away. At first, she thought it had happened during tension or disagreement. That seemed logical. Many relationships start to struggle when conflict appears. But as we looked closer, the timeline revealed something surprising. The urge to withdraw rarely appeared during conflict. It appeared during tenderness, during quiet moments, moments that most people would consider comforting. A partner sending a thoughtful message late in the evening, a conversation about future plans, A calm night together where nothing dramatic happened. Moments where care was obvious. Moments where the relationship felt steady. That was when her body reacted. Her thoughts would start racing. Questions would appear. Is this moving too fast? Am I sure this is the right person? What if I lose myself in this relationship? Small doubts quickly multiplied. Not because something was actually wrong, but because those moments carried emotional weight. Tenderness implies importance, and importance means the relationship matters enough to hurt if it disappears. When Laura finally saw this pattern clearly, something shifted in her understanding. For years, she had believed she was rejecting the other person, rejecting their personality, rejecting the relationship itself. But that wasn't what was happening. She was reacting to the feeling of emotional importance. Her nervous system was trying to protect her from the possibility of losing something valuable. And the easiest way to avoid losing something valuable is to never become too attached in the first place. Once this became visible, her past relationships began to look different. The sudden doubts, the criticism, the urge to create distance. They were not random personality changes. They were protective responses triggered by emotional closeness. And for the first time, Laura realized something important. Nothing had been wrong with the people she dated. The pattern had been happening inside her long before the relationship itself had a chance to fail. This opened the door to a completely different kind of work, because once a mechanism becomes visible, it can slowly be interrupted. Part 7. Learning to tolerate safe connection, 2030 to 2230. Breaking a pattern like this does not happen overnight. The nervous system cannot simply be told to relax. It learns through experience, repeated experience. So the work was not about forcing Laura to trust someone immediately. It was about slowing down the moment when the urge to escape appeared. When that familiar discomfort arrived, the goal was simple. Notice it, pause, and stay present a little longer than before. Instead of immediately questioning the relationship, she learned to observe what was happening inside her. The tightness in her chest, the restless thoughts, the sudden need for space. Rather than acting on those impulses automatically, she practiced sitting with them. At first, this felt extremely uncomfortable. Her body was used to solving the discomfort quickly by creating distance. Remaining emotionally present felt unnatural. But slowly, something interesting began to happen. The discomfort didn't last forever. It rose, stayed for a while, then gradually faded. And once it faded, the moment of closeness remained. A kind message was still kind. A quiet evening was still peaceful. Nothing terrible happened. This may sound simple, but for the nervous system, it was completely new information. For years, it had expected closeness to lead to disappointment. Now, it was witnessing something different. Closeness that continued. Care that remained steady. Presence that did not suddenly disappear. Trust did not appear as a sudden decision. It grew gradually through repetition. Small moments where she stayed present instead of pulling away. At small moments where closeness was allowed to exist without being interrupted. Over time, those experiences began reshaping her expectations. The nervous system slowly started learning a new pattern. Connection does not always end in loss. Stability can actually remain stable, and emotional safety can exist without needing constant vigilance. This kind of learning takes patience. But each moment of tolerated closeness becomes evidence. Evidence that the past does not have to repeat itself. A closing, 2230 to 2400. Months later, Laura described relationships in a way she never had before. She didn't say the discomfort had completely disappeared. Sometimes the familiar urge to run still appeared. But now she recognized it. She understood where it came from. "It still shows up sometimes," she explained. "But now I know it's just an old memory reacting." That realization changed everything. Because when a reaction is recognized as a memory, it no longer has to control behavior. And you can pause, you can question it, you can choose a different response. Many people believe they are afraid of love, but often the fear is something else entirely. They fear the loss that once followed love. They fear the moment when closeness turns into distance. They fear the emotional ground disappearing beneath their feet. So they leave early, not because they truly want distance, but because distance once felt safer than hope. The mind believes it is protecting the heart. Yet real healing does not come from avoiding attachment. It comes from experiencing something new, a connection that stays, care that remains steady, a relationship where closeness does not suddenly disappear. Healing is not learning how to attach. It is learning that this time, attachment does not have to end the way it once did. Once did. Once did. Once did.